My name is Sarah, and this was my first night at Hollowgate Asylum. Since I entered, the atmosphere was laden with a strange silence, almost palpable. The peeling walls and dark corridors created a feeling of desolation that made me tremble. It was as if the place itself was breathing, trying to swallow me. With each step I took, the echo of my footsteps seemed more intense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to stay calm and focus on my work, but the discomfort was inevitable. My heart beat faster every minute, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Even with the corridor light flickering intermittently, the fear seemed to intensify with the darkness around me. The asylum had a history of being an oppressive place, but I was determined not to let it affect me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared to face. As I made my rounds, the asylum's silence seemed to grow denser, almost as if I could cut it with a knife. I heard low whispers that seemed to come from all sides, but when I looked around, the corridors were empty. The feeling of being watched increased with each step I took. An icy chill took over my body when I saw, for an instant, a shadow moving quickly out of the corner of my eye. The shadow disappeared when I turned to look directly, but my heart raced. At every corner I turned, it seemed like something was there, just out of my field of vision. I wiped my forehead, trying to dispel the feeling that I was being followed, but it was as if something invisible was hiding in the dark corners, just waiting to reveal something even more terrifying to me. When I reached one of the oldest rooms, the cold increased even more, and I could feel an oppressive presence. The fear was so intense that my body began to tremble, and my breathing became labored. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves, but the feeling that something was watching me never disappeared. With my mind buzzing with questions and the feeling of being watched, I decided to explore areas of the asylum that were rarely used. The feeling of helplessness was almost physical as I passed through dusty corridors and abandoned rooms. Dust floated in the air like tiny particles of mystery, and the dim light from the lanterns could not fully illuminate the dark corners. I found a room that seemed to have been left in a hurry. The floor was covered with torn papers and broken furniture, as if someone had tried to leave quickly. In the corner of the room, hidden under a pile of debris, there was a broken drawer. My curiosity led me to open the drawer, and there, amid the dirt and debris, I found an old diary. The cover of the diary was worn and covered in dust, and I hesitated before opening the yellowed pages. The smell of mold and aging was strong, but what I saw made me hold my breath. The diary was filled with distressing notes about the workdays at the asylum. I felt a pang of fear when I realized that the words on those pages could have been written by someone who experienced terrible things in the same place where I was now. Each line seemed to carry a weight that I couldn't fully understand. With trembling hands, I began to leaf through the diary I found. The pages were filled with hurried and anguished handwriting, as if the writer was in a constant state of despair. The first entries talked about the daily life at the asylum, but as I progressed, the tone shifted to something darker and more disturbing. The nurse who wrote the diary described increasingly sinister experiences. She mentioned screams echoing through the corridors that no one else seemed to hear. The souls seemed to be in constant torment, she wrote, with a palpable sense of despair. One particularly shocking entry talked about a final ritual that she and some colleagues performed to try to calm the restless souls of patients who had passed away. The instructions were vague and involved ancient objects and obscure rituals that made my stomach churn just reading about them. The diary revealed details about cruel medical procedures and experiments conducted on patients, which seemed inhumane and disturbing. With each word, I felt the weight of the pain and suffering of those who had passed through there. There was something terribly wrong with the asylum, something beyond my comprehension. The feeling of being in a place filled with dark secrets intensified. The diary seemed like a cry for help from someone desperate for their story to be known, and perhaps for the tormented souls to finally find peace. After finding the diary, something changed in the asylum. The already oppressive atmosphere became unbearable. I began to feel a freezing cold that seemed to come from within the walls. My heart beat erratically, and the whispers that were once distant now became piercing screams echoing through the corridors. Every step I took was accompanied by a subtle but disturbing sound, as if something was following my footsteps. The shadows on the walls seemed to come to life. They stretched and contorted, creating shapes that seemed to move and advance towards me. The doors to the rooms started closing on their own with loud creaks, and objects in the rooms moved without explanation. The feeling that something was watching and waiting to get me was almost physical. The nights turned into a nightmare. I couldn't sleep, even when I was off duty. Insomnia was constant. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if an invisible presence was beside me, watching me. The feeling of being observed was constant and growing. Every noise at night made my heart leap and made me get out of bed to investigate, but I never found anything. Just the silence filled with tension that seemed ready to explode at any moment. It was as if the asylum was rebelling against my presence, amplifying the fear and sense of dread that were already so intense. Reality seemed to distort, and the line between what was real and what was a product of my disturbed mind began to blur. Every corner, every room seemed to hide something more sinister, and I felt increasingly trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. While investigating one of the upper floors, where reports of paranormal activity were more frequent, a feeling of discomfort took over me. With each step, the feeling of cold increased, and the air seemed to become denser. I decided to enter a room that had been locked for years, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. When I opened the door, a smell of mold and decay hit me. The light from the flashlight revealed a room in complete disarray, with broken furniture and papers scattered on the floor. In the darkest corner of the room, something caught my attention. A shadow moved slowly, seeming to twist and spin strangely. As I approached, the shadow took on the blurry shape of a human figure. A chill ran down my spine and my heart raced. The figure seemed to be trying to communicate something, but the sound that came from it was only an incoherent whisper. I could see the shape of a woman, with an expression of eternal suffering, as if she were trapped between this world and the next. Her eyes were empty, and despite the lack of a clear expression of pain, there was an aura of deep sadness around her. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move a muscle. The presence was so strong that I could feel her despair almost as if it were my own. When the figure began to dissipate, a feeling of desolation enveloped me, as if the very soul of the asylum was begging for relief. The encounter was so disturbing that it left me with the feeling that something profoundly wrong had happened there, and that the lost souls were still seeking a way to escape eternal torment. After the encounter with the ghostly figure, my fear turned into a desperate determination to find out what was really going on. I decided that I needed to directly confront what was causing all the panic in the asylum. I remembered the diary's notes about a final ritual, and searched for any related material throughout the building. I found an old storage room in the basement, full of old and dusty objects. Among them, there was a locked box that seemed to contain ritualistic items described in the diary. With trembling hands, I managed to open the box and find various artifacts. Candles, a small ceremonial knife, and a black-covered book, whose pages were filled with symbols and texts in a language I couldn't identify. The fear was almost paralyzing, but I knew I had to try something. I followed the diary's instructions as best I could, arranging the items as described. I lit the candles and placed the book in the center of the circle I had drawn with chalk on the floor. The book's words seemed to whisper to me, and a sense of urgency took over me. The atmosphere became even heavier, and the air seemed charged with oppressive energy. As I tried to recite the words of the ritual, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. I felt an icy and invisible wind blowing around me, and the shadows on the walls began to contort grotesquely. My heart was about to jump out of my chest, and I could feel the pressure building around me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I knew I was delving into something beyond my understanding or control. Suddenly, a deafening scream echoed through the asylum, making the walls vibrate. The candles went out, and the book flew away from me, landing with a thud on the floor. The chalk circle was interrupted, and the shadows that were previously contained began to spread uncontrollably. A sense of despair took over me, and I realized I had tampered with something I shouldn't have. The fear was now a constant presence, pressing on me like a crushing force. With the room in chaos and the ritual failing spectacularly, the sense of dread I was experiencing intensified. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, dancing frantically across the walls, and the environment was charged with such negative energy that I could hardly breathe. My body was in complete shock, and I knew I needed to get out of the asylum as quickly as possible. As I tried to recover from the terror, I heard heavy footsteps coming down the corridor, as if something was approaching. The sense of panic paralyzed me, and I could barely move. The fear was palpable, a constant weight on my chest that made every movement feel like a monumental effort. My eyes were wide open, and the sound of the footsteps seemed to echo throughout the building, increasing the feeling of imminent disaster. Suddenly, a blinding flash filled the room, and a powerful energy seemed to concentrate in the center of the space. The air was charged with an electric vibration, and I felt an invisible force push me back, almost as if I was being expelled from the building. The walls and floor shook, and the sound of a deafening roar echoed through the corridors. Amid the chaos, I managed to see the figure of the woman I had encountered earlier, now in a more defined form, as if she was fighting to free herself from eternal suffering. With a final effort, I managed to get out of the room and run through the dark corridors, my feet barely touching the ground as panic guided me. The doors closed behind me with dry creaks, and the building seemed to be disintegrating around me. When I finally reached the exit and crossed the door, the sense of relief was almost as intense as the fear I had experienced. Behind me, the asylum seemed to be in a state of complete chaos, with screams and indescribable sounds echoing in the air. Looking back one last time, I saw an intense light and a final sound of a crash indicating that something terrible was happening inside. I knew I had narrowly escaped, and the experience left deep marks on me. The asylum was now a place marked by indescribable terror, and I could never sleep again without remembering those hellish nights.
My name is Emily, and I work as a night caregiver in an old asylum that seems to have come straight out of a horror movie. The building is huge and oppressive, with endless corridors and the constant sound of creaking coming from the wooden floor. From the moment I started, a strange feeling of being watched never left me in peace. The old portraits on the walls seem to follow my gaze, and the silence of the night is interrupted only by the unsettling sounds echoing through the corridors. In the first few days, I was nervous about my new responsibilities, but soon I noticed some strange signs. While doing my nightly rounds one day, I heard a low, desperate whisper, almost like a cry for help, coming from one of the empty rooms. I went to check, but everything was in absolute silence. That same night, I noticed that one of the corridor lights flickered intermittently, even without any electrical explanation for it. The following week, something even more disturbing happened. I was in the break room, reviewing some documents, when the temperature gauge in the patient's room began to flash with a strange blue light. The reading suddenly dropped to a frigid level, below any normal temperature. I went to the room to check, but the temperature was normal, and the thermometer was now working perfectly. I tried to ignore it as a technical glitch, but a sense of discomfort persisted. It seemed that the presence of something unnatural was becoming more evident, and I could no longer ignore the feeling that I was being watched. It was on a particularly quiet night that I experienced my first apparition. I was making my nightly rounds, passing through the dark corridors, when an inexplicable cold took over the environment. I felt a chill down my spine, and when I looked into one of the rooms, I saw a vague figure in the corner. The image was of a woman in an old nurse's uniform, the same that the staff wore decades ago. She stood still, with a sad and empty look. I blinked, and she instantly disappeared. The feeling of terror was immediate. My heart raced, and my feet seemed glued to the floor. I went to check the room where the figure had appeared, but it was empty. The cold I felt was still present, as if the air had become dense and icy. I had the feeling that this nurse was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what it was. Since then, her presence seemed to be everywhere, and I could no longer pass the night without constantly feeling watched. Curious and increasingly scared, I decided to investigate the history of the asylum. I discovered that the building was inaugurated in the 1950s and that, in the following decade, there was an outbreak of pneumonia among the residents, leading to several deaths. Among the old files, I found the name of a nurse who worked there during that period, Evelyn Turner. Her description matched perfectly with the appearance of the figure I had seen. I went to the patient records archive and found several notes about Evelyn. It seemed that she was very dedicated, but there were also rumors that she was extremely strict and ruthless when it came to administering treatments. Many of the complaints and grievances made by the patients were about the way she treated them, especially during the disease outbreaks. The feeling that something was wrong intensified, and I began to fear what her presence might mean. That night, I was alone on a particularly quiet shift, which should have been a relief, but only made me more nervous. While reviewing patient records, I again heard that desperate whisper coming from one of the rooms. I went there, my heart pounding, and when I entered, the temperature dropped abruptly. What I saw in that room made me freeze in fear. Evelyn Turner was there, visibly clearer than before. Her eyes were fixed on me, and I could see the suffering etched on her face. She seemed to be trying to speak, but no words came from her lips. Suddenly, she raised an arm, pointing to a corner of the room where an old cabinet stood. Fear consumed me, and I hesitated. When I finally approached the cabinet, the door opened on its own, revealing an empty space, but the intense cold remained. I quickly turned and left the room, terror consuming me. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen stayed with me for the rest of the night. I tried to rationalize what I saw, but the image of Evelyn and the oppressive cold remained etched in my mind. In one morning after a particularly terrifying night, I decided to seek more information about Evelyn Turner. In the old archive of the asylum, I found a diary that seemed to have belonged to her. The diary was hidden in a secret compartment inside an old, dusty drawer. The pages were yellowed and torn, but I could still read some notes. The diary revealed a tormented woman. Evelyn wrote about her guilt and despair while caring for the sick patients, with increasing pressure on her to keep the patients alive, even when it seemed impossible. The last entry, dated the day of several patients' deaths, spoke of a feeling of total failure and a desperate plea for forgiveness. Reading those words was devastating. The weight of the emotions Evelyn felt seemed to have been transported through time and the very atmosphere of the asylum. The guilt and suffering I perceived as her presence were now much more understandable, but that did not diminish the terror I felt knowing that there was still a part of her trapped in that place. That night, I decided to face my fears once and for all. I mentally prepared myself for what I might find and went to the room where Evelyn had appeared before. The atmosphere was heavy, and I could feel the biting cold before even entering. As I opened the door, I was immediately enveloped by a sense of deep sadness. Evelyn was there, standing near the window, looking out with an expression of despair. She slowly turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a tear roll down her face. I was paralyzed with fear but also felt a deep compassion for her. "I don't know how to help you," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" Evelyn extended her hand, pointing to the window. The scene outside was in complete darkness, except for a faint light flickering in the distance. The light seemed to come from the cemetery, and I knew instantly that it had something to do with what she was trying to show me. With a racing heart and a sense of urgency, I went there, not knowing what to expect. When I arrived at the cemetery, the atmosphere was even heavier. The cold I felt in the asylum seemed like a relief compared to the icy air that enveloped the place. The faint light Evelyn had shown me was coming from an old forgotten tombstone, covered in moss and dirt. The tombstone seemed displaced, as if something had been buried there a long time ago. With trembling hands, I began to clean the tombstone. Under the surface, I found an old wooden coffin. Feeling an indescribable fear, I slowly opened it. Inside, there was an old diary, similar to the one I had found in the asylum, but this one was in better condition. The pages were filled with even more disturbing notes, including mentions of rituals that Evelyn had performed to try to save the patients, but that ultimately failed. I felt a mix of relief and dread upon understanding that Evelyn's torment was finally revealed. Her desperate attempts to help the patients and her immense guilt now had an explanation. I felt a sense of closure but also deep sadness in realizing that she would never find peace while her story remained unknown. When I returned to the asylum, Evelyn's presence seemed gentler. Although the terror she caused had not completely disappeared, the weight of her pain seemed to have diminished slightly. At least I had done my best to give her some form of closure.
Hello, my name is Robert, and I am a former patient of this asylum. I spent a few months here after a mental breakdown, and my stay was marked by days of despair and uncertainty. Recently, I heard disturbing rumors about disappearances and strange events that have occurred here since I left. Curiosity and fear led me to return, hoping to understand what is really happening. As soon as I stepped into the cold and worn corridors of the asylum again, a chilling sensation took over me. The environment was colder than I remembered, and a shiver ran down my spine. Strange creaks and whispers seemed to emanate from the walls, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I was no longer alone here. Exploring the old administration archive, I came across a pile of dusty documents. Among torn and stained papers, I found records about a missing patient, whose description matched the rumors I had heard. The documents mentioned paranormal incidents and unexplained events involving this patient, increasing my fear and the sense that something was very wrong. As I spent more time inside the asylum, I began to have disturbing visions. I saw the missing patient wandering through the corridors in a kind of nightmare. The images were fragmented and disconnected. I couldn't tell if they were stress-induced hallucinations or real visions of a dark past. Each vision was a punch to the gut, making me feel like I was losing control of reality. I tried to talk to some of the patients who were still admitted. Their stories were fragmented and full of fear. Some spoke of dark figures appearing at night, while others mentioned whispering voices coming from nowhere. Despite their descriptions, the lack of clarity in the stories made it difficult to understand what was happening. With all the fragments of information and documents in hand, I tried to piece together a puzzle of what was happening. However, the pieces did not fit together. The sense of frustration was palpable, and doubt began to gnaw at my mind. What I was seeing and hearing seemed disconnected and incoherent, and I began to question if all this was the result of my panicked mind. The situation quickly escalated. Loud, deafening noises echoed through the corridors, and fleeting shadowy apparitions began to appear. Every step I took seemed to be watched by something invisible and threatening. My heart was racing, and I was struggling to maintain sanity as the sense of terror intensified with every minute. Finally, I found an old tape recording of a missing patient, apparently talking about strange events and a sinister presence. However, the recording cut off abruptly, showing only a shadowy, undefined figure before ending. The lack of a clear conclusion and the feeling of being more lost than ever made me leave the asylum without definitive answers, only with a deep sense of discomfort.